Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Wood, the Assistant Library Director of the Wilmington Memorial Library. Today's talk, Essex England, Home of the Mayflower, is presented by the Wilmington Library in partnership with the Memorial Hall Library in Andover, the Tewksbury Public Library, and the Flint Memorial Library in North Reading. I'd like to welcome the patrons of all and anyone else who may be joining us. I also want to mention that all the libraries offer many online programs, too numerous to mention, but I encourage you to check out the websites and you may find something of interest to you. We're using a webinar format today, which means that we cannot see or hear you, but there is a chat feature located at the bottom of your screen for you to type in questions or any comments. And we'll get to the questions probably at the end of the lecture, unless there's something that seems to be very pertinent to the time, and I will interrupt the speaker. But please use the chat feature for your questions. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Linda McIver. She's an educator, lecturer, librarian, and genealogy researcher. She's retired from a 27-year career at the Boston Public Library, where she inaugurated the genealogy classes for patrons. She's the past secretary and civil records director for the federal records for the Massachusetts Genealogical Council. She's a member of the Massachusetts Society of Genealogists and the Essex, Massachusetts Society of Genealogists. She serves as the New England representative for the Essex England Records Office. Linda has a BA in history from the University of New Hampshire, a master's in education from Boston University, and she earned her master's in library science at Simmons. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Charlotte. It is just wonderful to be back at Wilmington and joined by Andover and North Reading and Tewksbury for this presentation. Wilmington was one of the first libraries to have me teach a genealogy course for them after retiring from the BPL. So it's a pleasure to now help you commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, and by telling the story of the ship. The voyage of the Mayflower in 1620 is seen as a defining moment in America's history. Some 10 million living Americans, 35 million worldwide, can trace their ancestry back to the ship's passengers. Come with me for a moment. Think back to those beautiful November days we had last fall. They were crisp and clear. Maybe you enjoyed them by driving to the coast and saw the soaring seagulls and watched the waves of the pale green coastal ocean. Exactly 400 years ago, one of those November days, actually November 19th, and after more than 65 days at sea, the Pilgrims awoke at daybreak, saw seagulls aloft and a pale green sea, not the deep blue ocean waters, and they saw land. It was a beautiful fall day like ours, not quite as warm, however. They soon determined that they must be off Cape Cod. They weren't supposed to be there, but they were supposed to be at the mouth of the Hudson River, as their land patent had said. So they headed south along the back side of the Cape with a fair wind until reaching Pollock Rip, the most dangerous area of shoals off the Cape. It was late and cold, and the winds had changed, allowing them to turn north and hove to off of Chatham, or today's Chatham. Basically, the decision was made not to head south, but to find safe harbors. So on the 20th, they hove to off the cliffs of Truro. And finally, on the 21st, found safe harbor off of Provincetown. And the plaque commemorates that first landing place of the Pilgrims, November 11th, 1620. Although you'll notice the OS there for old style. The English at the time had not adopted the Gregorian calendar yet. So today in our modern numbering system, they actually arrived on November 21st, 1620. It was a beautiful area then, Provincetown, as it still is today, but the area didn't provide as much fresh water and a food supply that they needed. So as they roamed around that area, as you know, they ended up in Plymouth, where they found a deserted Native American village. Perhaps even more notable than just the arrival itself is the arrival at Cape Cod on the 21st. Before disembarking, an agreement, later called the Mayflower Compact, was drawn up by the colonists, which has been interpreted as a key moment in the development of democratic government in America. This is not a long document. This is William Bradford's Old English actual version of the document. So significant because they came together to covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by the virtue thereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. This provided a legal standing for them, since their patent was supposed to have provided them to be in Northern Virginia at that time, designated up through that Hudson River area, Hudson River Valley. 41 men signed the compact. 7 of those 41 men were from Essex, England, including the captain. This historic period for us has not been lost on the English either, evidenced by the many pubs called the Mayflower, especially scattered around southern England. This one is at Lee-on-Sea in Essex. Much is known about what happened in America after the Pilgrims had arrived. So my presentation will concentrate on the early history of the ship, the Mayflower itself, where she might have come from, and the departure from England for the New World. A case will be made for the importance of the county of Essex, England, and its history, as the captain of the ship and her governor were both from Essex, and the Mayflower itself might well have been an Essex-built ship. As the possible historians you are, or maybe genealogists, come along with me as we search for the evidence, the documents from a period in history that's not the easiest to research. Essex is a large county, just to the northeast of London. Many people who work in the city of London today could commute from Essex. Its name is derived from the Saxons, the Germanic tribes who colonized the country in the 5th century. Essex was the kingdom of the East Saxons, thus became Essex. And according to the early historian Bede, their capital was London. It's always amazing when I look at this shot and compare our Essex, Massachusetts to our Essex, UK. They're almost like twins. There is a major difference, however, the size. As you can see here, Essex, Massachusetts is half the size of Essex, UK. Facing the North Sea, some of Essex harbors became important by Elizabethan times, particularly the deepest harbor along the northeast coast between London and the Humber, which was a large tidal estuary. Harwich in the northeast corner of Essex, from which great Elizabethan seamen such as Hawkins, Frobisher, and Drake set out on some of their voyages. Harwich, as the English call it, claims to be the hometown of the captain of the Mayflower, and furthermore, that the Mayflower was built there. This is a map from 1610. It's John Speed's map of Essex from 1610. So it's contemporary with the Pilgrim's travels. And it not only points out, as maps are so wonderful in doing, towns and boundaries and rivers and basic geographics, but it also tells us a little bit about the culture. And you'll see here a version of what they see as their major transport on the ocean. But you'll also see this rather ominous sea serpent, sea monster, whatever, as a reminder that travel on the sea could be very dangerous for them for the periods that they were on it. This is a little later print from Harwich, about almost a century later, but it still indicates the importance of the town, the vibrancy of the business going on in the harbor, the dominance of the church, St. Nicholas's, and also the fortification at the entrance to the harbor. There is only one primary source describing this momentous voyage of the Mayflower to New England, which survives in the State Library of Massachusetts, of all places, the manuscript called of Plymouth Plantation, an account written between 1630 and 1647 by one of the key pilgrims, William Bradford, who became the second governor of the new colony. This shows the first page of the original manuscript and also a cover of a modern edition of Bradford's history, rendered into modern English, but not until the early 1900s, by Harold Paget. This shows a paperback copy version of it by Dover Publications in 2006. However, at the commemoration of the 400th anniversary, two new editions came about. One is a beautiful hundreds of pages annotated edition published by New England Historic Genealogical Society. And the second one, a fascinating one, published by the State Library of Massachusetts, which of course holds the original document, manuscript, digitized it within the last few years and presented a publication which is almost recreates the size of the actual manuscript. So as you hold it in your hands, it's almost like reading the manuscript itself without going to the library. They also, in their edition, added a little help for us, those of us who need a little help in understanding 17th century handwriting. So it's a wonder to have. In Bradford's account, however, frustratingly, there are gaps in his account. For a start, he does not identify the ship by name that took them to the New World. He only indicates that two ships were originally involved. One was bought in Holland by the Pilgrim Fathers, which took them from Leyden to Southampton in England to meet up with the other larger ship of 180 tons, which had been hired for them in London. As you can see here, for several years, the Pilgrims had journeyed and escaped from England, spent time in the Netherlands, in Leyden. We can see contemporary shots of the church, Peter's Kirk, Church of St. Peter's, and it was surrounding the church where the Pilgrims settled in for those years. Many of those buildings still exist, including this one, which eventually became an almshouse founded in 1655 for the benefit of the poor people. Until 1625, John Robinson lived in this place. He was the Pilgrims' minister. His followers set sail from Leiden to America in 1620. He was expected to follow, however, never did that before his death. It was originally envisioned that both ships would make the voyage, the little one and the big one. The smaller probably taking the Pilgrim Fathers and then staying on to be used for fishing. But as the ship set out from Southampton, problems arose with leaking in the smaller ship, resulting eventually in it having to be abandoned and reliance made solely upon the larger ship to take them across from Plymouth in Devon. Later in the voyage, Bradford describes how one of the main beams was bent and cracked on this ship, to the extent that it was feared she would not complete the voyage. But the captain assured everyone that she was sound below the waterline, and the beam could be lifted into place with an iron screw. This suggests that the ship was an old ship also, and it can be assumed that she was a typical Elizabethan merchant ship. There remains, however, no picture, no description, and no record of where it was built. John Speed's map of 1610 does have a couple of images of ships which match the modern replica of the Mayflower. So these are the old walls of Southampton. And from John Speed's map, several indications of the look of these transport. These were not ships that the common person in England would want to be on. They were transport ships, many of them for in Southeast England, of course, to go over to especially France to pick up wine and other products. And this second version of the ship entering the Thames headed for London. And of course, Mayflower too. Thankfully, Bradford does name the captains of the two ships. A Mr. Reynolds was the captain of the smaller ship, and a Mr. Jones, the captain of the larger. So how then do we know that the ship captained by Mr. Jones was the Mayflower, and what do we know about its early history? Right from the start, one of the key sources of disagreement among the colonists described by Bradford was the proposed apportionment of land among them to grow crops once they were settled. The decision first arrived at was to hold the land undivided for 7 years, after which it would then be allotted to the planters. However, in 1623, after the colonists had been working the land for 2 or 3 years, Bradford describes how a compromise agreement was reached and how each person was allotted an acre of land for them and theirs, and that no more would be allotted until after the 7 years were up. As chance would have it, the original record of this agreement, as drawn up by Bradford's own hand as governor, survives as a part of the records of the colony of New Plymouth. And there in the heading, he at last names the ship, which brought them over as the Mayflower, the earliest record of the ship's name. Over the centuries, it was thought that this was the only ship of the time named the Mayflower, which resulted in the wrong Mr. Jones being linked to it, a Thomas Jones, and a general perception that he was incompetent or even conspiratorial in landing the party not in Virginia as planned, but much further up the coast in what became New England. This, of course, is the reconstruction of Plymouth Plantation. New Plymouth was, of course, not the first English settlement to be founded in America. The settlement had already been established in Virginia at Jamestown in 1607. And at the time the Mayflower was due to set out, Virginia was the main focus of English colonization and trade. Indeed, it was originally intended that the Mayflower should go to Virginia. But William Bradford describes how unhappy the colonists were about settling in Virginia, fearing that they would suffer the same religious persecution as they would in England. So they agreed that they would, quote, live as a separate body by themselves, end of quote. under the central government of Virginia. And they sent 2 of their congregation to England to arrange matters with the Virginia Company. By 1620, through a generous grant from the King James the First, just such a settlement under the patent of the Virginia Company, but separated from its government, was to be established and named New England. And the chief members of the colonists felt that this was the best place to go, especially because of the profit from fishing that could be obtained there. Apparently, James I himself was not against the idea. When Sir Edwin Sandys, a key member of the Virginia Company, took the emissaries from Holland in Leiden to meet with the king, and they reported that they would support themselves by fishing, he remarked, quote, "So God have my soul, 'tis an honest trade. It was the apostles' own calling." That may be about the only thing that they agreed upon with the king. But what of the real Mayflower and its captain? It wasn't until 1904 that R.G. Marsden published an article about his discovery of who Mr. Jones really was and the identity of his ship from London of 180 tons, through looking at contemporary acts of the High Court of Admiralty records in London, which up to then had not been systematically researched. He discovered that there were, in fact, many ships called Mayflower in 1620. It was a common name. He succeeded, however, in isolating the records between 1609 and 1624 of one ship called the Mayflower, captained by Christopher Jones. In Marsden's time, Christopher Jones's name was already known in connection with the Mayflower, as he appears as a witness at the bottom of the will of one of the London contingents. William Mullins, you will know that name from Priscilla. William was originally a shopkeeper and came from Dorking in Surrey, England. Mullins was also one of the signers of the Mayflower Compact and one of nearly half the original colonists who died during the first year of the settlement. So as you look down at the bottom of Mullins' will, you'll see the signature of Christopher Jones, spelled here, Joanes. According to the High Court of Admiralty records, for most of the period between 1609 and 1622, the Mayflower and its captain seem to have been based in London, shipping wine from France, Spain, Portugal, and the Canaries. By 1611, Christopher Jones and his family had settled in Rotherheight. This is where he died less than a year after his return from New England in 1622. His burial on 5 March 1621-22 is recorded in the burial register of St. Mary's Church. How wonderful we have the registers of the churches. However, when he presented some wreckage he had picked up out of the Thames in order to gain Admiralty rights to those to the wreckage, the record of its appraisal in 14 January 1610-11 describes Christopher Jones as of Harwich, and his ship called the Mayflower as also of Harwich. Thus, some historians of Harwich claim that the Mayflower was built there. Although this is possible, as Harwich was a shipbuilding town right through the 19th century, there are no actual records surviving to show this. We rely on Jones's documents and what we know to be true of Harwich. And as we look at the documents, hope your eyes are adjusting to the Old English. We see Christopher Jones's burial record here, buried 5 March 1661-62. And a print of Harwich indicating its special status, really, This shows the arrival of the Queen of France visiting Harwich. And as a major seaport, still in a sea building area, still building ships in the mid-1800s. The parish registers of St. Nicholas at Harwich that we saw in the other print, however, do survive and support the claim that Christopher Jones came from there. Unfortunately, the part of the register that might have recorded his baptism in 1570 is missing. So the earliest record of his is his first marriage on 27 December 1593 to one Sarah Twitt, a 17-year-old who was the daughter of a neighbor. And X marks the spot on this document as you see the record of the marriage. Other records include the baptism and burial of their only son, Thomas, who died in infancy, Sarah's own death in 1603. 6 baptisms of their first 3 children are also recorded. The baptisms of their next 4 children, however, appear in the parish records of Rotherheight from 1611 to 1619, demonstrating the family's residence there. But a last child, John, was baptized back in Harwich in March of 1620. It is thought that Josiane, his second wife, must have gone back to the family home to have her child while her husband was away on the famous voyage taking the Pilgrims to New England. It is now thought that the Mayflower first set out on its voyage from Rotherheight. And so looking at a couple more, here's Thomas Jones and the burial record of the first child. He had 8 children in all, and only 1 from the first wife. And here, the marriage to his second wife, Josiane, who apparently came back home to have her last child in Harwich. And finally, the record of the birth of that final child in 1620. So to support the idea that the Mayflower left from Rotherheight, this emblem established by the town suggesting sailed from Rotherheight on the first stage of its epic voyage to America, suggesting the first stage was not actually the final part. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It's also pretty evident as you walk down the street in Rotherheight and you quickly come upon the Mayflower pub on Rotherheight Street, a pub dating back to 1550 approximately. A traditional English pub, as they describe, surrounded by cobbled streets, the outside deck jetty and cozy candlelit restaurant have stunning river views. You can spot the original 1620 mooring point of the Pilgrim Fathers Mayflower ship. Warm yourself by the open fire and imagine who may have been sitting in your seat 400 years ago. There's nothing ancient about their marketing, though. This is from their website. It's very appealing. We want to all visit the Mayflower pub someday. And a pub that a plaque that describes inside. It wasn't originally, of course, called the Mayflower. It precedes that because of its age from the 1500s, originally called the Spread Eagle. And to kind of symbolize the position on Sundays in the restaurant, only candlelit, only foods from the 1600s, and a complete visit back to the 1600s of the Mayflower era. Outside, also a plaque commemorating Christopher Jones's connection, who moored his ship, the Mayflower, at this jetty, had a skinful, and headed on his pilgrimage to the land of the free. The skinful suggests he had a little bit too much to drink before heading out. He is buried in Rotherheight, at St. Mary's Church, where his children were baptized. The gravestone is lost to history, but to commemorate his connection with the church, the establishment of this sculpture. Turning to the location of his home in Harwich, the location of the family home in Harwich can be discovered by looking at the surviving will for Christopher Jones's father, Christopher Jones Sr., which states that the family house, which he left to his wife, was on the quayside at the end of High Street. The house, which survives today in what is today called King's Head Street, and recent restorations show that it was originally two houses. And that the large chimney stack in the middle must have been built, joining the two into one to accommodate the growing family size. The will also shows that Christopher Sr. was a seaman and had shares in two ships, one, the Marie Fortune, which he left to Christopher Jr., and the other, the Centurion, which he left to a younger son, Roger. Like father, like son. Other Harwich records show that Christopher Jr. was a freeman of the borough, and he became one of the burgesses in 1604. So in addition to the parish registers, there are other records that connect Christopher Jones to Harwich at the time period before his moving the family to London. Another key person connected with the Mayflower, named by Bradford, was a Mr. Martin of Biliricky in Essex. This was another Christopher Martin. Bradford introduces him as the third of the three that received the money and made the provisions in England, the other two being John Carver and Robert Cushman from Leyden. Bradford states further that Martin's hometown of Biliricky was the place, quote, whence several others came to join them, as well as from London and other places, end quote. So was Biliricky a final rendezvous point for the London contingent? When we say the London contingent, we mean those merchants and financial backers who did not necessarily have a religious motive in going to the New World. This has led some to speculate where this contingent might have joined the Mayflower. Did they go up to Rotherheight or down to a small fishing town in Essex on Lee-on-Sea, lying on the north coast of the Thames estuary and now part of the borough of Southend-on-Sea? Some claim that the Mayflower was also provisioned there, although Bradford makes clear that it was for the most part provisioned at Southampton. Here's Lee-on-Sea and a contemporary shot of Lee-on-Sea and the waterfront. As the governor, meaning not a political governor, but one in charge or partly in charge of the finances and the physical organization of the trip, as a governor of the bigger ship, Christopher Martin was probably more important to the Pilgrim Fathers than even the captain, Christopher Jones. He was a merchant who had already sunk some of his money in ventures connected with Virginia, who had an interest in migrating to the New World. He was probably the chief person who managed the finances for the Mayflower voyage and is one of the signers of the Mayflower Compact. With Martin, we have many records related to the manor that he eventually was admitted to and lived in. Records of the English manors can be a treasure trove of information related to not only the people, but to the religious aspects, how the land was divvied, to the point that one of the manorial histories in England, Cecil Humphrey Smith, states, "The great value of these records is that they provide a most vivid account of the daily lives of the ordinary people of the English village. The manor was, even more so than the parish, the administrative unit controlling the local populace, their comings and goings, good and bad behavior, loyalties, and commerce." And we can see the sheer volume of some of the records. There are major efforts in England to identify who is actually holding many of the manorial records. And they've recently created a database, which is located on your handout. But lots of information about Christopher Martin here, and you'll see it indicated as Christophorus. Some of the ancient documents from this period, you will see a lot of Latin sometimes used, especially when the royal had converted back to Catholicism, and often the Greek versions of some of the words, but lots of detail of specific terms related to the running of the manors you see throughout the documents. Let's go back. In addition to the records from the manor, Christopher Martin also appears in the parish registers of Great Burstead, the parish to which Biliricky belonged. One record is notable to us today. Martin was elected as one of the church wardens in that parish. In 1620, it was reported by church officials that he failed to provide the financial accounts he maintained during the time he was church warden. This chimes well with the similar cavalier treatment by Martin of the Leyden Group's funds, with which he was commissioned to provision the Mayflower in London. Instead, he provisioned it in Southampton against the advice, or at least partly, of Mr. Cushman, and refused to give a reason for the change in conditions of the agreement made with the colonists from Leyden. It appears that Christopher was not very universally liked. Bradford describes how things must have come to a head between the fighting groups, and it's amazing that they still had enough finances left to make the trip. Came to a head at Dartmouth, where both ships had put in to repair the leaking smaller ship. The smaller ship had been leaking off and on throughout this time period. In a letter from Dartmouth to a colleague in London written by Cushman, which appears in Bradford's account, he describes how concerned he was about how much their resources were being used up before they had even left the coast of England. He seems to have confronted Martin. The quote from Bradford is, "Mr. Martin says he neither can nor will give any account of it. And if he is called upon for accounts, he cries out that we are ungrateful for his pains and care, and that we are suspicious of him," end of quote. It is quite likely that part of the tension between the Pilgrim Fathers and Martin and the other merchant adventurers derived from their different agendas for settlement and a greater willingness by the adventurers to incur financial risk. This is the Port of Dartmouth. And you can almost envision watching the two ships heading out to what they hope to be open sea finally. But it was not to be. As they left, the small ship, the Speedwell, again began to leak. And even though they were almost into the Atlantic, came back to Plymouth. There isn't much left of Plymouth from that period because of the bombings from World War II. Bradford passes over what must have been a difficult decision to abandon the smaller ship altogether at Plymouth and to reduce the amount of people who would be able to embark on the voyage on the one remaining ship. Quote, "These troubles being over and all being together in the one ship," end of quote, they put to sea again on September 6th, 16th in our dating, with a prosperous wind. Today, a board fixed to the wall of the island house on the Barbican Quay at Plymouth, supposedly near to where the Mayflower was boarded, lists the names of the pilgrims who sailed from there in 1620. Besides the crew, there were 102 passengers, and 10 of those came from Essex. Alongside Christopher Martin, his wife, and 2 servants, and Christopher Jones, the captain, there were 2 more from Harwich, John Alden, who you know well, I'm sure, Cooper, who was apparently the first to step ashore when they got to the New World, and Richard Gardner. There was also John Craxton and his son John, originally from Colchester, Essex, but part of the Leiden group at the time they left. And there was another from Great Bursted, Peter Brown. So Christopher Martin, John Alden, Richard Gardner, and John Cranston were among the signatories for the Mayflower Compact. Only 35 members of the separatist pastor John Robinson's congregation actually sailed on the Mayflower, while 66 people from Southampton and London who had little religious motivations and were part of the adventurers group left as well. So here you see the full board in Plymouth, indicating all of the names, usually their occupation, and the children and the wives that were there as well on the trip. Here's Christopher Martin of Great Bursted in Essex, his wife and his 2 servants. Here's William Mullins, along with Priscilla. Mullins was famous in having brought along with him dozens and dozens of pairs of shoes to be prepared in a new world. And the last part of the plaque. This shows a grouping of the 102 who sailed by family, if they were families. And this shows the remainder who survived after that first winter here in the New World. And so began what we come to have called the Great Migration of 1620 to 1640. Over those 2 decades, many more people came from Essex, and several rose to positions of some importance. For example, here is Thomas Hooker, the firebrand lecturer of St. Mary's Church in Chelmsford, England. Also fled to Holland to escape persecution, but eventually migrated to New England in 1633 alongside John Haynes. Together, they were instrumental in the founding of Connecticut in 1639, if you have connections to Connecticut. John Haynes, who served first as governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony from May 1635 to May 1636, before serving as the first governor of Connecticut from 1639, was baptized in Messing, Essex, a small village lying between Malden and Colchester on 26 June 1594. His entry in the register can usually be identified by a note added later, which says, "of Old Holt." It's wonderful to see some of these documents, not only for the official vital records, but the notations that are sometimes there that help you identify more specifically the locations where they're connected. And you see on the map that we've been looking at several times, there is an annotation for this is Old Holt. And it was this area between these homes where Haynes' home originally was. Another associate of Hooker was William Pinchon, who came from Springfield, Essex, the neighboring village east of Chelmsford. He migrated to Massachusetts on the Arbella in 1630. The Pinchons were eventually instrumental in establishing our town of Springfield, Massachusetts. But perhaps the most significant person with an Essex connection who migrated to New England on the Arbella in 1630 was John Winthrop, who eventually came to dominate the Massachusetts colony. Originally the lord of the manor of Groton in Suffolk, he was married at Great Stambridge in Essex, a small village just north of Southend-on-Sea, to Mary Forth, the sister of his fellow undergraduate friend at Cambridge. Aunts and cousins were also from Essex. And you can see his church here and the wonderful commemorative stained glass windows for not only him, but for his fleet called the Winthrop Fleet, which brought many ships, excuse me, to Massachusetts. Finally, in 1643, and for his allegiance to the opposite religious camp to the Puritans, that is the Anglican Church and the Royalists, the great-great-grandfather of the first president of the United States, the Reverend Lawrence Washington of Purley in Essex, had his living sequestered. And you see this description, not very complimentary, for that he is a common frequenter of alehouses, not only himself sitting daily tippling there, but also encouraging others in that beastly vice, and hath been oft drunk. This wonderful document comes from the 1st century of scandalous, malignant priests. Lawrence relocated to serve incognito in the much smaller and impoverished parish of Little Braxted. He was from Purley on to Little Braxted and was eventually buried at Malden in 1652 to 53, as is recorded in the register of the parish of All Saints. His son, John, migrated to America in 1656 as the ancestor of George Washington. And here is Lawrence Washington's burial record. So what, you ask now, after all of this, and certainly your adaptation by now to the Old English, what eventually happened to the Mayflower? 2 years after Christopher Jones's death, his widow, with 3 other joint owners of the ship, obtained a decree from the Admiralty Court for the ship's appraisement. Christopher had owned 1/4 of the Mayflower, and probably he afforded that because of his inheritance from his father, but we can't be absolutely sure of that. So the appraisement was carried out in 1624, duly carried out by 4 Rotherheight mariners and shipwrights. They found the ship in poor repair and itemized the value of the parts of the ship and its equipment. The hull, mast, yards, etc. of the ship itself were valued at 50 pounds, a fraction of its price in earlier years. At this point, the Mayflower disappears from history. It was probably deemed uneconomical to repair, and so was broken up, perhaps at Rotherheight, where many a later ship would have been, such as the Tamarier on this slide, which fought alongside the Victory at Trafalgar. Turner's famous painting shows the Tamarier being towed up the Thames to its final berth in 1838. During the Mayflower tercentenary in 1920, the legend that a barn in Buckinghamshire at Jordan's, which was undoubtedly made of ship's timbers, was built partially by timbers from the Mayflower surfaced, causing a great deal of controversy. It was concluded, however, that there was not a scrap of material or recorded evidence for the claim. So I, like many historians, would love to tell you what happened to the Mayflower. But I can't tell you what happened to the Mayflower too in the last 3 years. She spent her life in this mailbox where complete renovation and reconstruction of the ship occurred. Mayflower 2, of course, is owned by Plymouth Plantation, was undergoing its multi-year restoration at Mystic Seaport. The restoration of the nearly 62-year-old wooden ship at the time was carried out over several years with the project scheduled for completion in 2019, of course, in time for the 400th anniversary. There are beautiful photographs. You can check the handout for the link to the reconstruction that's listed there and see some of these amazing shots. Almost all of the interior was basically gutted by this wonderful crew trained in 17th century skills using 17th century tools, doing what most consider an amazing job. So its official launch after much of the restoration was done was September 7th of 2019 with much fanfare. Lowered into the Mystic River for the first time since her restoration began in November of 2016. In the weeks following the launch, the remaining stages of the restoration were completed in the water. The ship was ready for a spring 2020 return from Mystic Seaport Museum. Now, the return wasn't quite as expected. Originally, the plans pre-pandemic had been that the Mayflower would come down Boston Harbor with the USS Constitution, and it would spend a week there for visitations. That, of course, was canceled. But Plymouth Plantation really wanted to get the ship back to Plymouth during the year of the anniversary. So leaving Mystic on July 20th for 2 weeks of sea trials with the beautiful US Coast Guard Eagle. And if you've never seen the Eagle, it's a spectacular ship as well. Had to hunker down a bit for one of our many tropical storms we've had over the past 2 to 3 years in New Bedford for protection. And then completing its last leg on August 10th, 2020. These next couple of shots were taken by Henry Scannell. Those of you who know the Boston Public Library probably know Henry as the last curator of the microtext department, who made it his definite thing to do on August 10th, 2020, was to be in Plymouth to see the ship arrive. And after that, this is David McCrae, fellow genealogist. The ship was illuminated the rest of 2020 as part of the modified commemorations. So I thought you might like to see this not often seen photograph from 1957, photograph of the Mayflower 2 floating on the River Dart in Dartmouth. We saw shots of that in the previous slides in 57. The boat, a scale replica of the original Mayflower, was created as a gift for the USA by the UK, recognizing the contributions, the US contributions to the Second World War effort. So here she sat before her trip to Plymouth. There are other commemorations that did or didn't happen. This Mayflower autonomous ship was built for the 400th anniversary. It was christened belatedly in September of 2020, 400 years to the day since the original Mayflower left Plymouth. It was to undertake 6 months of sea trials and short trips before setting out across the Atlantic next spring. It had some issues. It was the largest ever autonomous vessel. In other words, there were no human beings on the ship, and apparently they had some technical problems. So we'll have to wait for future updates on that Mayflower. Some other exciting things, though, did happen even belatedly. Captain Christopher Jones's house, home in Harwich, was opened as a museum. It had been purchased by, of all things, an archivist from Chelmsford. And he, at least 10 years ago, had been not only restoring it, but really delving into and getting down to what the house was like in the 1600s. So that was an exciting development. Now, I know you're going to wonder why we're looking at Henry VIII here, but if it were not for Henry, we might not have been telling this story in the detail that we have today. Henry, as you know, in 1533, split from the Roman Catholic Church in order to marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And as a result of that split, of course, creating the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And shortly after this happened, he sent out the order that every parish church needed to record and preserve all birth, burial, or actually baptism, burial, and marriage records. And as a result of that, they were also told, in order to preserve them, they should either make or buy a chest that the documents would be placed in for preservation. So the vital records type documents ended up in chests all across parishes across England and Scotland and Wales. And eventually other town and parish documents were found in the chest. So you not only see the vital records kind of documents in these chests across England, but other town type important ones. And then, of course, the record offices have done their part in housing those documents in modern times mostly, and today in digitizing many of them. And it's because of those works, such as the efforts of the Essex Record Office, that we have digitized documents. The Essex, 5 to 6 years ago, Essex finished digitizing all of the parish registers back to the 1500s when from whence they existed, and also the wills from the 1400s. They're all digitized, and as of a year or so ago, the indexing has been placed on Ancestry.com. So although the Essex office maintains ownership of the actual full text documents, the indexing is free either on Essex website or on Ancestry.com now. And you will see documents, the full text of the original English, Old English. So I know you've gotten used to reading it now, and you'll be great when you attack your family. If you have Essex, if you think you have any connections to Essex, the importance of knowing the county, if you have English roots, is that, as we know, all genealogy is local. So not only do you need to know the county, but you need to know the parish so that you can look at the parish records. So even if it ends up that you don't find any records in Essex, you've at least eliminated one possible county that you don't have to research anymore to locate your ancestors. But you will see the full page. The full page is digitized. So when you order the copies, you will see the full page that your record appears on. You may be saying, how do I get back to the 14s, 15s, and 1600s? And that, of course, is a step that you take by looking at the more modern records, the civil registration records, when the government took over responsibility for recording vital records, and of course the English census. The 1921 census is about to be released this year soon, if not already have been done. So as you start to trace back from 1921, when you get to 1851 in the census, you get the first time you have an exact birthplace listed. In 1841, you had the names of all the household members as well. So remember, genealogy is local. You need to get down to the very local representation for your ancestors. Family Search can certainly help. They have a wonderful help center with a lot of videos, webinars related to performing English research. They also, Family Search has a wiki, much like Wikipedia, but it's dedicated to genealogy and history aspects of research. And here you'll find an overview for England, but you'll also find an overview for resources in each of the counties in the UK and in Great Britain. So thus we kind of end in the year after our celebration for the Mayflower 400th. Charlotte, if we have about 5 more minutes, I will go through kind of a quick representation of some of what had been planned.
That's fine. And I also wanted to mention that our library and many of the libraries, I believe, have ancestry.com. And I don't know if that would also be helpful, if maybe you'd like to comment on that. It has to be used in the library, but it's fine to take a little more time.
It may have to be used in the library after starting in January, but what Ancestry did, and I'm glad you brought it up, Charlotte, is that during the pandemic, almost at the beginning of the pandemic, realizing that all these potential customers were not going to be in libraries, but they were going to be in their houses, potentially doing their research for hours and hours at a time, having all this extra time. They allowed libraries that had been subscribers to Ancestry.com to allow remote access. They did that at the sort of at the beginning of April, I think, of 2020, and have extended it through to the end December of 2021. We don't know yet what will happen in January, but do take advantage of it now. If your library had been a subscriber, they have been providing remote access to it. Heritage Quest is also provided in every library in Massachusetts. It's one of those paid for by the state of Massachusetts, and that's always remote access. So Heritage Quest can be used too while you're home, starting your new English research here.
I was going to say thank you for that. I thought Ancestry had ended for at-home use in June, but it's good to know it had been extended again. So thank you.
Yes. So if it's okay, we'll just take a quick look at some of the months of planning that had been done for the commemoration. It started on a media night back in March of 2019, and it started right here in Massachusetts, not only right here in Massachusetts, but right here in Boston, where I am, a block away from New England Historic and Genealogical Society, where to anyone connected with the commemoration from the media and the media that needed to know what was going to happen within the next few months met at New England Historic Genealogical Society. So as you see here, the CEO of Mayflower 400th UK was present, as was the representative from Leiden, as was the representative from Plymouth 400. As was, for the very first time in a commemoration of the arrival of the Mayflower, a representative from the Wampanoag tribe here. This was not an easy thing for Paula Peters to happen. There was a lot of disagreement amongst the tribe, that there was no guarantee that the story would be told any differently than it had been in the past. But Paula persisted, and as a result, this is the first time that 4 nations have participated in commemorating the arrival of the Mayflower. In April, information went out to the general public in another event at New England Historic Genealogical Society in April 2019, and that had a visitor from the Consul General in New England, representing the Queen here, Harriet Cross, as well as Terry Geegan from Bath, Maine, who had designed and created this wonderful replica of the Mayflower II, which sat each day out in front of New England Historic Genealogical Society, along with, created by the Wampanoag, in fact, the son of Paula Peters, who designed and created this beautiful representation of Wampanoag mother and child. You will see, and I'll just take you back to your handout a bit, as so many databases and things that will help you either start or continue perhaps your research related not only to the Mayflower, but to the Great Migration as a whole are listed with the links to those sites. One of these is the passenger list. It's an interactive guide in that it kind of pinpoints all of the locations where the people on the passengers were located, including the ones that were over in Leiden. You can, as you zoom in, you go down to the ground level. This is Leiden near the church and the folks that were there, or back on the mainland. If you zoom in for Christopher Martin here and the Essex folks, then you get a detailed kind of background description of those individuals. So it's really just to even play around with it is fascinating. Also created the Pilgrim Database, and there is a link to that about the ancestors, and that's on New England Historic Genealogical Society's AmericanAncestors.org database. That was done in cooperation with the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, so a cooperative venture. And then finally, one of my favorite ones is the Migration Parish website, where you can see where the Great Migration folks that have been identified with concrete evidence shows what counties they all came from. And you'll notice that Essex had the largest number at 177 of identified Great Migration migrators. And that is supplemented by the book published by the creator of this, Robert Charles Anderson, published his directory of all of those folks as long. So here's just a quick look at your handout, which you can print off, of course. And also something that is not, I didn't notice that it had been updated until after I had sent the copy to Charlotte. But if you go to the Nutfield Genealogy blog, it has a current list of what is left of commemoration type events. It was updated in August of this year, and there are still some things going on. One of the big events did happen in September 4th and 5th, the Maritime Salute that happened in Plymouth, but you can see some other events there. This is the direct link if you want to put that down quickly. It's a wonderful blog that's been done for a long time by Heather Wilkinson Rojo about anything and everything really New England genealogy related. She is a Mayflower descendant herself. So it would be, once you get to the blogspot.com/2021, it was updated in August, so 082021 updated Mayflower 400th, and you'll get to her website. And my parting gift to you is, if you just can't stand another pumpkin pie for this Thanksgiving, might you consider a gingerbread version of the Mayflower to commemorate that first Thanksgiving at your table? I thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you've learned a fair amount about the Mayflower and the people from Essex County, England. Thank you.
Well, Linda, thank you so much. I don't see any questions. If anybody has a question, please type it in the chat box, but you do have some nice comments. And one of the comments is that we should all meet at the Mayflower restaurant, which I would agree to. That looked like
I agree with that. Let's drink to that, Charlotte.
Let's drink to that. Looks like a wonderful place to go. So I would like to thank you for the presentation. I learned quite a bit. I didn't know anything about the origins of the Mayflower. And thank you for pointing out the importance of the vital records. The handout I will be emailing to all the attendees after the program, so you will have a copy. And no questions, so thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My contact is on the email and on the handout as well. So if you do have questions later or want to know anything about researching Essex or England in general, please feel free to reach out to my email or phone.
Thank you for attending, and good afternoon.